Good afternoon and welcome to the South Carolina Public Service Commission. We are here today on an allowable ex parte communication briefing. President of the hearing rooms, Commissioner Britt, Commissioner Caston, Commissioner Whitfield, Vice Chair Williams. I'm Delton Powers. Commissioner, we have a new commissioner who has not been sworn in yet, Commissioner Henley, and Commissioner Belser is on leave this week. Mr. Westerhill, if you would please explain today's proceeding.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, as the chairman mentioned, this is a proceeding in non-docket number 2024-46E. It is subject to a notice of request for allowable ex parte briefing beginning today, Thursday, March 5th, following the conclusion of the Commission's 1 p.m. scheduled Commission business meeting. The allowable ex parte is being presented by the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, Dominion Energy South Carolina Incorporated, the South Carolina Public Service Authority, also known as Santee Cooper, Duke Energy Carolinas LLC, Duke Energy Progress LLC. The subject matter of this allowable ex parte briefing, as noticed, is entitled, quote, Updates on the Southeast Regional Transmission Planning, which is SERTP, stakeholder process pursuant to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Order Number 1920, or also FERC Order 1920. This is the same subject matter to be discussed today during this briefing, as was noticed by the Clerk's Office of the Commission on February 17th, 2026. As I mentioned, this is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section number 58-3-260C. The requirements of the statute are in part that an allowable ex parte be confined to the subject matter which it has been noticed. I therefore ask the presenters, the commissioners, staff, and all who are present to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to this specific topic, which is updates on the Southeast Regional Transportation Planning stakeholder process pursuant to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Order Number 1920. Secondly, Section 58-3-260 also prohibits any presenter, commissioner, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to any ultimate or penultimate issue which either is or is likely to come before the Commission. Third, I would ask the presenters, commissioners, and staff, and those present here in this hearing room, to refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or documents of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. If so, a copy of that reference document must be presented for the record. Fourth, if anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope of the briefing, which is the subject matter of the briefing, or does not comply with or fails to conduct themselves in accordance with the provisions of South Carolina law, Section 58-3-260, governing an allowable ex parte proceeding, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection must be made by those who are present. And finally, everyone in attendance today in the hearing room must sign in or register whenever they entered the hearing room. If you did not, please do so before leaving. Also, you would have been provided a form at the door whenever you entered by a commission employee. Please read and sign the form before leaving the hearing room today. The form is provided to you so that every person in attendance will also certify, and is basically stating that to your eyes and to your understanding that everyone today and through this allowable ex parte proceeding was conducted in accordance with South Carolina state law. Mr. Chairman, the request and notice for this allowable ex parte briefing are in order and is ready to proceed.
Thank you very much. First, before we begin, I would like to all parties to council to identify themselves, beginning with Dominion Energy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. My name is Chad Burgess, and I am counsel for Dominion Energy South Carolina.
Thank you. Duke Energy Carolinas in progress.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Williams, members of the Commission, including new members of the Commission, returning members of the Commission. I'm Sam Wellborn here on behalf of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. Thank you.
All right, and Santee Cooper.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Stephen Pelcher on behalf of Santee Cooper.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Cooper, you're here for some reason.
I had to it took me a second, Mr. Chairman, after that one to compose myself. But Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, good afternoon. My name's Ashley Cooper, and I'm with Baker Donaldson Law Firm, and I'm appearing on behalf of all three utilities today, Dominion, Duke, and Santee Cooper. And I'll do just a brief introduction of the
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And ORS.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and Commissioners. My name is Chad Torrey, and I am here today as the designee of the Executive Director of the Office of Regulatory Staff. I'm joined today by Staff Attorney Tom Filopoulos.
Thank you, and welcome to this hearing, briefing. All right, Mr. Cooper, then I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. As I stated when I introduced myself, I'm here on behalf of all three utilities, as this is a presentation on behalf of all three utilities, although we have just two presenters. And before I introduce them, I want to just briefly review with you the purpose of this briefing. And it will begin by providing you some background information on local planning and regional transmission planning, because that provides important foundational context for FERC Order 1920. So that's where we will begin. They will then discuss the components and requirements of 1920, including the long-term regional transmission planning process and what that term means and what that means in their world of planning. They will also describe the RSE engagement process. Some of that will be a review for some of you who were here last time. There will be an overview of cost allocation, that concept under 1920 and how it would apply. And that will be the discussion. In their presentation, they have purposely stayed away from discussing any potential solutions, any specific compliance measures they're thinking about to allow for a complete discussion and a more open discussion. Along those lines, they have also asked me to relay to you to please feel free to interrupt them at any time with any questions. They would like for this to be a very beneficial process, and they're happy to answer questions at any time. So, and with that, we will proceed with this panel, and then there will be another panel for the ORS, and Ms. Dawn Hipp, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the ORS, will just come immediately after this panel and appear. So the presenters for this panel are Mr. Scott Parker, who's Manager of Transmission Planning for Dominion Energy, and Mr. Sammy Roberts, who's the General Manager of Grid Operations Planning at Duke Energy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Powers, Vice Chair Williams, and Commissioners. Today, my colleague Scott Parker and I are going to provide you with a presentation on Order 1920, covering the objectives that Attorney Cooper mentioned just a minute ago. And also, like many FERC orders, it's a bit of an acronym soup. So, like Attorney Cooper mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go through the presentation. So the first thing we'd like to do is introduce the two regions. As Scott will talk about, Order 1000 started with regional transmission planning, so we will be talking about regions since Order 1920 applies to those same regions. So we'd like to introduce to you the two planning regions that include transmission providers in the state of South Carolina. And I'm going to provide an overview of the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Group. You may hear it called the SERTP or SERTP. And Scott will provide an overview of the South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning Group, or SCRTP. So as you can see from the map, the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Group covers quite a large region of the Southeast. It spans 600 miles south to north, and it spans 1,100 miles east to west. The balancing authorities within this SERTP region, SERTP region, serve combined peak loads over 124,000 megawatts. It's a collaboration of 9 transmission planning entities and in an 11-state area that coordinates these regional transmission planning activities. The SERTP region includes, I believe it's 4 FERC jurisdictional investor-owned utilities, maybe 3, and 6 non-jurisdictional transmission owners, whom all voluntarily elected to participate in the SERTP region. The SERTP sponsors have constructed and put into operation over 83,000 miles of transmission lines, and the SERTP's main functions are open and transparent regional transmission planning in accordance with the FERC orders, including 890, 1000, and in the near future, Order 1920 that we're discussing today. So now I'm going to have Scott describe the South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning Group.
Thanks, Sammy. Good afternoon, Chair Powers and other commissioners. So South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning Region is much smaller, just comprised of Dominion Energy South Carolina and Santee Cooper. We'll talk in a moment about the progression and the history of the region and in compliance with the various FERC orders that required various things to be done from a transmission planning perspective. But for various reasons, we in Santee Cooper, Dominion and Santee Cooper, chose to be in a smaller region, which we're moving forward going to change and merge with SCRTP. But currently, SCRTP, between the two companies, we have over 10,000 megawatt peak load, which I think both Dominion and Santee Cooper have hit new peaks in the last year. Dominion Energy South Carolina just shy of 5,000 megawatts summer peak last year, and I believe Santee Cooper hit a new winter peak this year in excess of 5,600 megawatts. We are, of course, probably not hard to see. We are from the map that we are one of the smallest, if not the smallest, planning region in the country. Although in compiling some of these statistics between the two companies, we have over 10,000 transmission circuit miles, which actually does exceed New England ISO. So by transmission miles, we are not the smallest. So that is the update on the SCRTP, or what comprises the SCRTP planning region. Now I'll jump into a little bit of the history of the FERC orders that have brought the requirements for local and regional transmission planning about. So prior to 1996, there were no planning requirements from FERC or open access transmission requirements. Then in 1996, sort of the landmark order 888 that opened access to the U.S. Transmission bulk electric transmission system to non-transmission owners, and that sort of kick-started a host of other rule making from FERC around a number of things, but particularly in the reason we're here today, around transmission planning. And the first major order after that open access order was Order 890, which was just short of 10 years after the original Order 888. And that was the first order that brought about requirements for transmission planning under FERC requirements. After that, a few years later, Order 1000 was issued. That brought about the requirement for a regional transmission plan. It also brought the concept and requirement for cost allocation methodology and interregional transmission planning coordination. And now, well, I say now, it's been 2 years since FERC initially issued Order 1920, and that takes planning to the next step, or more appropriately, probably several next steps in this order, which, among other things, requires a 20-year planning horizon, whereas practice has been in a lot of cases for a lot of utilities to do 10 years. This requires a 20-year time frame for developing transmission plans. It requires identifying scenarios, long-term needs, and various benefits that must be measured to any regional proposed transmission projects amongst the planning sponsors. And then it also requires an ex ante cost allocation methodology. And along with this, we are supposed to seek state engagement in this cost allocation and other aspects of the order. And we'll talk more about those requirements in the coming slides. I should have said prior to moving to this slide, so as a result of the Order 1920, the SCRTP got together with the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Organization region, and we determined that based on all the coordination and additional requirements in Order 1920 that both planning areas would be best served if we merged the two regions into, or rather merged the South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning Region into the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Organization. So that is the plan to comply with 1920. When we file our compliance for the order later this year, we will then seek FERC approval to combine the regions, and we will, upon approval, we will dissolve the South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning Organization. Okay, quick overview of the existing regional transmission planning process, and this applies for SERTP as well as SCRTP today. And the way that works is each sponsor, each utility, we call them sponsors in the planning region, develops their local transmission plan to address needs that they have, reliability needs, aging infrastructure needs, various reasons we have transmission projects that we plan for to meet local needs. Each of those sponsors' plans, and typically that is done over a 10-year time frame, those plans are then rolled up into a regional planning process that is carried out per Orders 890 and Order 1000. Along with that, there is an interregional coordination that occurs between the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning area and the adjacent planning areas to coordinate, being that it is a grid and power flows in and out of the various regions. The interregional coordination must occur between the planning areas so that they're aware, each area is aware of what the other regions are planning, and make sure that there is the plans for each region are well coordinated, and perhaps maybe even interregional planned projects can be developed, if that makes sense. That occurs today. As we go forward with Order 1920, we will start this process that Sammy's getting ready to describe that will require a 20-year outlook for planning regional planning projects. So, again, there's a lot more to it in Order 1920 about what goes into that 20-year plan, but the main takeaway here is we are expanding that horizon for which we look at beyond 10 years out 20 years. With that, I'll turn it back over to Sammy, who will talk about the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning process for 1920.
So I'm going to talk about Order 1920, but before we get there, we've talked about the who's going to perform this process, and we talked about the how we got there, how we got to 1920. So any questions up to this point? Right. Seeing none, I'll dive into the Order 1920 overview and tell about the process. Sure to provoke some questions. So with Order 1000, once again, that came out in 2011, as Scott said, and that required regional transmission planning. Well, Order 1920 changed that a little bit with a lot more details and a lot more complexity, and it required long-term regional transmission planning. A lot of our transmission planning today is done at most on the 10-year planning horizon, whereas Order 1920 requires us to do transmission planning on a 20-year planning horizon. And so as Scott mentioned, in May of 2024, FERC issued their order after technical conferences, notice of proposed rulemaking, and then issuing the final rule, culminating in issuing the final rule. So just to give a high-level summary, transmission providers with 1920, transmission providers must engage in long-term regional transmission planning that covers a 20-year planning horizon. And in that process, they'll develop 20-year models. We'll run power flows for those 20-year models, and we'll identify long-term transmission needs associated with those 20-year models that have taken best available data as inputs. I'll describe more about how we get inputs into that process in a minute.
May I ask a question? And if I'm getting ahead of it, let me know. But looking down that list, that third bullet where you had measuring the benefits of those transmission facilities, is that the functionality measurement, or is that some economic, or both? Or what does that mean?
So it all boils down to dollars. Each of the 7 benefits we quantify in terms of dollars. And so I'm going to go over in a little bit more detail those on a subsequent slide.
I'll not ask another question.
No, you can ask all the questions you want to, Commissioner Caston. So I talked about identifying long-term transmission needs by running power flow analysis with those 20-year models. Next, we identify transmission solutions to those identified needs. Then, as Commissioner Caston was referring to, we will measure or quantify 7 benefits required by the FERC order. And once again, I'll cover that in a subsequent slide in a little bit more detail. And then we'll evaluate the transmission facilities that are potential solutions with respect to some selection criteria. And if selected, they will proceed on to cost allocation. And so basically we'll make sure that with respect to the benefits and the cost to benefit ratio and some other selection criteria, that they can proceed on through that gate. And then if they proceed on through that gate and they're going to be part of the plan, they go on to cost allocation. And I'll talk more about cost allocation toward the end of the presentation. With respect to cost allocation, the transmission providers must, not an option, must file one or more ex-ante regional cost allocation methods that apply to the selected long-term regional transmission facilities. The other thing I failed to mention with Order 1920 is throughout the order, FERC is pretty clear that they are just requiring a process. So we got to get this process in place. And it's very detail-oriented, a lot of work going into making sure we put things in place to comply with the process. But it does not prescribe specific outcomes or specific facilities that have to be chosen by the Regional Transmission Planning Organization. So this may be a little bit difficult. Well, it probably is very difficult to read. So I'm going to hit it at a high level, and then I'll go through each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. So Order 1920, it lays out this multi-step complex process for conducting this 20-year planning, so planning over a 20-year time horizon. and it effectively covers 6 steps. You compile your scenario inputs. The order requires you to have 3 scenarios. You compile your scenario inputs. With those inputs, and that's with stakeholder input, with RSE input, et cetera. With those inputs, you develop your 3 scenarios. And those 3 scenarios are also going to have some sensitivities. One of them that's required is extreme weather. The other one, other sensitivities are things like fuel price volatility, or large load forecast error, that sort of thing. And with those scenarios, you run your 20-year models, power flow models, and you determine long-term transmission needs. And then you identify solutions or facilities that address one or more of those needs. Then for each of those solutions, you determine benefits, those 7 benefits I talked about. And then you basically go through your selection criteria, and you determine which facilities are moving forward to the regional transmission expansion plan for purposes of cost allocation. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Sounds simple, but it's not. There's a lot of details under the hood that go behind putting this engine together and making it work. So with the first step in Order 1920 is you're required to consider 7 factors with respect to the inputs for developing your 3 scenarios. And those 7 factors are shown in this middle rectangle box. And so the 1 through 3 are mandatory, they're required, and they deal with laws and regulations, i.e. like South Carolina Act 41. And integrated resource plans, once again, Act 41, and they're mandatory as an input to these developing these scenarios. The other 4, like trends in fuel costs, trends in technology, potential resource requirements, for example. If you've had generators that have requested interconnection and they're continuing to get kicked out because of a transmission upgrade hurdle, that needs to be considered. And then any utility or government policy goals. But I will say those last 4, whereas the first 3 are mandatory, the last 4 are, I won't say discretionary, but they're subject to de-weighting or discounting with respect to inputs to developing your 3 scenarios. Then we move on to step 2, which is scenario development. And so sponsors, once again, the order requires sponsors must develop at least 3 plausible and diverse scenarios. And plausible scenarios must be reasonably probable. The best analogy I could come up with to describe reasonably probable to you is it's reasonably probable that Clemson will make it into the NCAA tournament. So. Probable and plausible. So collectively, the scenarios must capture probable outcomes, reasonably capture probable outcomes. So we don't want to study something that's not plausible, right? And if we don't study something that's diverse, it basically channels your outcome, and you may not encompass all the possible needs associated with the regional study. And so once again, plausible and diverse scenarios are the key words of the day. So the scenario development process starts with an evaluation of collected scenario planning inputs, as I mentioned before. And with the scenario development process, there will be opportunities for engagement with RSEs, and we'll incorporate that feedback. And then also, once the scenarios are finalized, there'll probably be opportunities with respect to RSEs to evaluate those selected scenarios before they have to be published, so before they're published. So now I'm going to go over steps 3 and 4, and that's running the power flow analysis in step 3 to determine the long-term transmission needs. Once again, there's a mandatory sensitivity in that analysis of those 3 scenarios, including sensitivities. and that's with respect to extreme weather. We have to look at extreme weather in our analysis, but you can look at things like cyber attacks, significant forecast error, fuel price volatility, and other uncertainties that could occur in that 20-year time horizon. So if you determine your needs, now that you've determined your needs, you have to determine solutions, what will fix that need. And is there a good regional transmission facility that fixes that need? So you identify one or more solutions, and then you go through your selection criteria to see if you meet those needs. But first, you need to calculate your benefits, because that's part of the selection criteria. FERC has in the order that you need to have a benefit to cost threshold, and that's 1.25 is the cap that they state in the order. And so in order to determine benefit to cost ratio, you need benefits calculated, quantified. Cost, we come up with cost estimates all the time for transmission planning projects. So there are 7 benefits that FERC says we have to quantify. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to go through each one, but once again, feel free to ask questions as I'm going through these. The first one is avoided or deferred reliability transmission facilities and aging infrastructure replacement. So basically, you can reduce transmission expenditures through long-term regional transmission facilities that avoid or defer local transmission projects that are otherwise needed for system reliability. And I'll give you an example. So let's say Duke Energy Carolinas has 5 local projects in their local transmission plan, and Dominion Energy South Carolina has 4 local projects in their local transmission plan. And then you go through this long-range transmission planning process, this modeling and running a power flow, and basically the Order 1920 process. And that shows that for Duke Energy Carolinas, you can reduce those 5 projects to 3 projects if you implement this long-range transmission planning transmission facility. And Dominion South Carolina can reduce from 4 to 3 local projects. Well, that's a benefit of that long-range transmission planning facility. And so we quantify and capture that benefit with the cost associated with those project scenarios. The second one is a reduced loss of load probability, so reduction of firm load shed or reduced planning reserve margin. And so your long-range transmission facility, long-term regional transmission facility, can result in increasing transmission transfer capability during times of need, high peak demand. And so if you enable more transfer capability into an area like Santee Cooper, then for them serving their winter peak demand, then that additional transfer could lower or reduce the loss of load probability. And that can be factored into the next round of determining what extra capacity is needed going forward. So the third one is production cost savings, and it's like it sounds, it's fuel and variable O&M cost savings resulting from the long-term regional transmission facility. And basically that facility is enhancing your ability to dispatch more economic units. So for example, that facility enables you to avoid running oil peaker units. And so you have some fuel and O&M savings there. The fourth one is reduced transmission energy losses. So if you put up larger, lower resistance conductor with this long-term facility, you can reduce energy losses and thus lower the incremental generation needed to serve those losses, and that reduces your fuel and O&M bill. The fifth one is reduced congestion due to transmission outages, and that, once again, that's a production cost savings, fuel and variable O&M. And so that savings is when you have a long-term regional transmission facility that reduces the extra cost during periods of transmission outages that constrain economic dispatch. So similar to that number 3 production cost saving was one, but now you're considering a transmission outage that would otherwise cause a constraint and cause you to run out of economic dispatch. Now this long-term regional transmission facility reduces the need for that out of economic dispatch, and thus you experience savings. Number 6 is mitigation of extreme weather events and unexpected system conditions. I think that one speaks for itself. And then the last one is capacity cost benefits through reduced peak energy losses. So if you reduce losses, transmission consumes megawatts for those losses. If you reduce those losses at the peak, you can reduce the megawatts needed to serve those losses and thus the capacity needed to serve those megawatts. So those are our 7 benefits, and once again, we've got to quantify each of them. There are 3 different models that are needed to quantify these. There's production cost models, there's resource adequacy models, and then of course there's power flow models. So there's 3 different models needed to quantify all these benefits. And of course, each transmission provider within SERTP is not using the same models. And so we're having to bring all that together with respect to being able to calculate these benefits. So step 6 is the evaluation and selection process. And so there you're basically taking that benefit to cost ratio as one of the metrics, but you're going to have other metrics, other criteria that are going to be used for selection of these resources. So you go through that filter, and whatever falls out that's selected, then you proceed on to cost allocation. So with respect to cost allocation, the transmission providers, once again reiterating, the transmission providers have to develop an ex-ante cost allocation methodology. And there is another pathway for a state agreement process to get to a cost allocation on a facility, but this is the backstop that's got to be filed with your tariff. This is the cost allocation methodology that will apply if nothing else is there to apply, like a state agreement process. So I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Scott, and he's going to talk about relevant state entity engagement. And that's where the transmission providers have to engage the states on designing the state agreement process during the RSC engagement period.
Thanks, Sammy. So that was a lot. There's a lot there. But before I jump into the RSC, what that's all about and the engagement that the Southeastern RTP has had with the RSCs to date, were there any questions on what, I know that was a lot that Sammy covered. Okay. All right. Let's see. So RSC engagement. Well, first we'll talk about what the RSC or relevant state entity is. It's FERC says it's any state entity responsible for electric utility regulation or siting electric transmission facilities within the state or portion of a state located in the transmission planning region, including any state entity as may be designated for that purpose by the law of such state. And so the PSC, South Carolina PSC, has designated ORS to serve as the relevant state entity for the South Carolina utilities. So what's the role of the RSCs in Order 1920? They are to inform the evaluation process, selection criteria, and cost allocation method adopted by the transmission providers in a transmission planning region. As far as the transmission providers in the transmission planning region, they are to provide a forum for the RSCs to negotiate a cost allocation methodology and or a process for determining future cost allocation methods for LTRTFs, which are long-term regional transmission facilities. Those are regional lines or potentially substations, projects that go along with those lines. such that it enables meaningful participation. The Order 1920 originally required a 6-month period of time called the RSE engagement period. FERC has granted an extension of SERTP's RSE engagement period when it was requested, and we'll get into the timeline here in a minute on where we are with that. To date, Southeastern RTP has held 6 meetings with RSEs for the region and held 5 stakeholder meetings that are open to the RSEs, and I think ORS has actively participated in those as well. So here's the relevant state entity engagement timeline. It began with the first webinar on December 5th, 2024. We had 5 months in the beginning of 2025 where the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Region and the South Carolina Regional Transmission Planning regions got together and started working on our compliance process development. From June to September, we held additional RSC discussions around scenario development and needs, benefits, measurements, and selection criteria. In the fall of this past year, we started the RSC discussions around benefits measurement and cost allocation, and that will continue that and additional correspondence and working with the RSEs through October of this year, ultimately with a compliance filing deadline of December 12th, 2026. I should say the RSE engagement period officially ends on October 9th of this year. So here's just a list of the various engagement sessions we've had with stakeholders and RSEs. On the left are the so these have been separate meetings, but covering some of the same topics and some of what Sammy just went over. So sort of all aspects of the order. Particularly with regard to the RSE engagement, as I said, we started with the first WebEx, sort of giving an overview for everyone, like we're doing today, of the what's in Order 1920, sort of unpacking it. It's over 1,300 pages long, so there's quite a lot there. So breaking it down, what's required at a very high level. And we also worked on developing our process flow, which Sammy showed, just sort of how the whole process will work. Because it is, in just on paper and a lot of words and 1,300 pages, really had to sort of break it down graphically to how is this whole thing going to work. So we kind of went with the overview and then sort of developed how that process will work over those next few months that I mentioned. So that was followed up with a March session of last year where we talked about that process flow as we saw it and what our plans were for the RSE engagement. Then in June, we had a session on what we see as far as what our plans are to comply with the order around scenario development and the identification of long-term transmission needs. We then had a meeting on the 25th of September to talk about evaluation criteria, and that's criteria that you once you've gone through the identification of needs and projects, the order allows additional criteria that the sponsors can use to evaluate various projects to see to what degree they make sense, make good sense, and that are more not economical like cost to benefit ratio, but more qualitative criteria. So we went over those with the RSEs. Then in October, we talked about the benefits measurement and cost allocation. And then started to say last month, but end of January of this year, we had solicited and gotten plenty of RSE feedback among the various states. we accumulated that and reviewed that with the RSCs and gave our thoughts of where, responded to those things that we could, where we, and I say could because we're still developing some of the answers and some of our thoughts and plans around the process that will be in our compliance document, but where we could supply answers to those questions, we did, and then also tried to give an indication of when we thought we would have answers to some of the questions that we did not have answers for at that time. This engagement, well, so those are the meetings we've had. The engagement, as I said on the previous slide, will continue through October. We have continuing sessions planned for spring. I think maybe, we're thinking sometime in April around continued engagement around cost allocation and maybe other topics that are related to that, if not exactly around cost allocation. Having mentioned cost allocation, that is a big topic and rather, can get rather complex, and that's why I'm going to let Sammy talk about that.
Thanks, Scott. All right, thanks, Scott. Any questions up to that point? All right, seeing none, I'm going to move on to talk about FERC Order 1920 cost allocation. So once again, if a long-term regional transmission planning facility is selected, then it basically proceeds on to the be eligible for going into the plan and regional cost allocation. So in the order, it speaks to two primary paths with respect to cost allocation. And those primary paths are the ex ante cost allocation methodology, which has got to be in our tariff. All the transmission providers have to agree on a given ex ante cost allocation methodology and include the same methodology in the tariff. And then there's also a state agreement process, or the states come together and they all agree that here's the steps we're going to take, and there's some prescribed requirements. Here's the steps that we're going to take to provide a cost allocation for this facility if we get to that point in this process and we need to allocate cost.
Can I ask something on
Yes.
that? Wait, there, is it? Okay, sure. I'm trying to follow, trying to piece it all together. So, kind of thinking back to that stage one thing where it had those three mandatory things that required, I think it had laws and regulations, and thinking about the cost methodology. And then you got all these different utilities which are in different states and SERTP, and I have no earthly idea how you're going to keep up with all that, but I'm glad it's y'all and ORS, I guess. But thinking about this cost allocation, if there are, and I assume this is part of that, if there are distinctions in state laws or regulations that would possibly cost more than this state or than South Carolina, is that part of this process that considers that, where you try to find those kind of distinctions or agreements?
So the order primarily states that we have to consider those first three that you're referring to. And so laws and regulations with respect to resource mix and demand, and then probably the other one that applies mostly are IRPs. A lot of us have state IRPs or resource plans.
Decarbonization and something else, I think.
Yeah, that was the second one. But as far as, we had to use the best, FERC is stating, we had to use the best available inputs with respect to developing these scenarios. And then also, we had to populate the model with the base case with the current network topology. And then we had to create a reference case for, a 20-year out time frame. And we're going to compare the reference case against the change case for a lot of these benefits that we're qualifying. It mainly comes down to what FERC stated in Order 1000 is that the cost allocated to anybody must be commensurate with the benefits. And so ultimately, when we get to the end, if we select a facility, that's why it's important with respect to taking our time and getting these 7 benefits right, how we're going to determine them, to make sure that we're meeting that requirement to allocate cost commensurate with benefits to each sponsor.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the ex-ante cost allocation methodology a little bit more. Once again, it describes how costs are allocated to the beneficiaries, as I just responded to Commissioner Caston's question. And that's when a facility is selected to move forward to cost allocation. And it's going to basically, it's been selected to go into the regional plan. And of course, ex ante refers to you're determining this ahead of time. It's going to be in the open access transmission tariff filing for each sponsor's OAT. And so it's going to be, if that's what's in there for cost allocation methodology, and it's approved by FERC, that will be the backstop or the default cost allocation methodology. If a state agreement process is arrived at with the states in agreement, and it's been communicated to the transmission provider or SERTP sponsors, that has to go, a description of that has to go in as an attachment to your filing. And so basically, if you get to that cost allocation point for a facility and states say, raise their hand, we want to pursue the state agreement process, you can pursue those steps that were outlined in that attachment to the filing. But you only have 6 months to come up with a cost allocation that's appropriate, that FERC will say is just and reasonable. And that's all the states together. So it's not just South Carolina, it's all the states had to agree on this process for a cost allocation. And I'm jumping ahead to the state agreement process, but I can feel a question coming on about it, so I'm trying to answer it ahead of time, proactive. So we did present our cost allocation methodology, proposed cost allocation methodology, ex-ante cost allocation methodology to the RSCs on October 9th of last year. And so they have gotten a flavor of what we're looking at with respect to making sure that the sponsors are allocated cost in accordance with the benefits that they're receiving based on those calculations. So I think it was a really good overview associated with that application of that process. And FERC says in the order that the cost allocation must follow 5 of the 6 principles that were established in Order 1000. And I've got those here, and I'll just read those. Once again, costs must be allocated in a way that's roughly commensurate with benefits. No involuntary allocation of cost to non-beneficiaries. So you can't just say, you don't benefit, but we're going to assign you some of this cost anyway. The benefit to cost threshold is no greater than 1.25. Allocation must be solely within the transmission planning region unless those outside voluntarily assume some of the costs because they see some benefit. And it has to be a transparent method with respect to determining benefits and identifying beneficiaries. And so those are the 5 principles from the 6 identified in Order 1000 that we have to follow with this ex-ante cost allocation methodology. And I think we hit all the marks with respect to the October 9th presentation, but it is subject to that feedback and refinement if necessary. Now, as I alluded to earlier, there's the state agreement process path as well. And once again, the state agreement process has to be adopted. Once a facility is selected, the state agreement process has to be pursued, invoked, and you come up with a cost allocation no later than 6 months after that facility is accepted. So you have to have the process laid out, and you have to be ready to follow it quickly. Once again, just being frank, the state agreement process has to have a lot of buy-in from states in the SERTP region. And one of the things that's unique about the SERTP region is we have munis, we have co-ops, we have non-FERC, non-state jurisdictional entities. I won't name names, but I've got some on here, but I won't name. And their input is required to go into this agreement on a state agreement process. So it could be very challenging for us to get consensus on a state agreement process that we can move forward on. But as required by Order 1920A, SERTP is working to facilitate those discussions with RSEs. And lastly, I'll reiterate that state agreement process still has to make sure that the outcome is going to be just and reasonable, and considers those 5 cost allocation principles from Order 1000 and specified in Order 1920. That's good. So I think that's the end of our presentation, and so now we'll go into next steps. So our next steps are, we'll continue engaging with relevant state entities through that October 9th, 2026 date that Scott talked about, when the state engagement period ends. And thereafter, there'll be, opportunities through the process for, for still having participation and feedback and input, such as the scenario development. The SERTP, as Scott mentioned, will request to join SERTP, and we'll have to make our compliance filing. Each sponsor will be a party to this with their oath, but we'll have to make that compliance filing no later than December 16th of this year. And also the South Carolina Utilities suggests that we have a follow-up briefing with this commission after the end of the RSC engagement period, or October 9th, 2026. So any questions that we can answer?
Any commissioner questions?
One,
Commissioner Caston.
what happens if after that 6 months there's not an agreement, or, I mean, it's got to occur, or?
If the states invoke their state agreement process in the cost allocation, because we've selected a facility or facilities, the default or backup will be the ex ante cost allocation methodology developed by the transmission provider. So that's what will happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Mr. Whitfield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation today. Just I guess a quick, not a quick, but a difference in the FERC Order 1000 versus where we are with FERC Order 1920. As I recall it, back then, of course, 1920 is focusing more on long-term needs, long-term plans. In 1000, back then it was not only not long-term, but it, as I remember, I hate to use the word voluntary, that's not quite the word, but I remember the regions being lumped into all across the country in the RTOs. And of course, if you weren't in an RTO, like we're not, we're vertically integrated state, you were paired off, and the acronym was something different from SERTP. I can't remember it, but Santee and Dominion and some of our unregulated entities such as the munis and others were lumped in there too. And I don't recall anything being mandated other than, we'd have a transmission case if a generation asset was, you know, it was needed for that, or if the load growth required it. And I guess now what you're saying now under 1920, this is a very detailed out order to look at this now over a much longer period, 20-year period of time. And again, as you state in the next steps, the utilities would suggest a follow-up briefing to us after October 9th. So is that what you would describe as one of the bigger differences, is being mandated now for long-term versus not from FERC Order 1000?
I'll speak to it a little bit and then let Scott, since he covered Order 1000. But I mean, with Order 1000, primarily we're still using the 10-year models. We feed up from the sponsors up to this regional model and studies and plan. But with Order 1920, I agree with you. The order is, to me, it's a lot more prescriptive associated with planning, and it does cover a 20-year planning horizon, which, to me, we're going to have to be very deliberate and thoughtful about the inputs, especially in that year 10 to 20, because of the cone of uncertainty growing associated with what year 10 to 20 is going to look like. It's somewhat difficult with year 1 to 10.
Well, particularly here in the South, with our population growth and demand growth, during that time frame, 2011 time frame, we had some years where load growth from all the utilities was incremental at best. Mm-hmm. And I guess now, with this massive demand and growth, particularly here in our state and in the Southeast region, we're having to look more long-term. Is that a driver for 1920, I guess?
I mean, demand growth that's that very first factor. Now it's dealing with laws and regulations associated with that demand growth, but it's demand and resource mix. But I think that was one of the drivers, one of many drivers associated with this order. And yeah, I mean, that needs to be factored in, but once again, you're looking at projecting things 20 years out. And so once again, it's going to require some really thoughtful input to make sure we come up with a meaningful models, meaningful study results, and facilities that are considered.
Well, I certainly appreciate your presentation. I appreciate you updating us and being on what you're doing, what's going on now, and also look forward to you briefing us as we head deeper into this year and then again after October 9th.
I'll just add to what Sammy said. I'm not completely sure I followed your recollection on that was before I was in the planning region, but going back to the original orders, I think Order 1000 and even 890, where there was a lot going on, including the push for markets and those things that South Carolina and the Southeast did not form a market. But we just to keep in mind that while we do have to do all these things and we do have to, FERC said in this order that they felt like the transmit, we may not have completely agreed, the utilities, but they felt like the planning for transmission was not long enough, that it wasn't considering all the benefits, the 7 that Sammy went through. We felt like we did consider a lot of those, but I think one thing to keep in mind too, like that Sammy said, was there's nothing in the order that requires the transmission providers to agree to build anything, any of these regional. They mandate that you go consider all these things and do these scenarios and evaluate these things, but at the end of the day, you don't have to choose to build any of these these long-term transmission facilities.
Said that, as you said, they were mandating the process.
That's correct.
Not to build anything.
That's correct. That's an option. The other thing, just to hit on, is that they did say a lot of what was in Order 1000, 1920 does not change that. Those are still in effect. They also said that it does not change, utilities' ability to plan in that shorter time frame for reliability needs and aging infrastructure. This order doesn't change the ability to do all those things, which was a concern. So, anyway, I just wanted to say to let you know that even though we do, it's a big effort and has to be, all these things have to be considered, and it's a lot of work. At the end of the day, it doesn't force you or force utilities to choose to build anything at the end of the day.
That's got me, and I think I remember you or Mr. Roberts saying that the smaller region that Dominion and Santee were, I guess, put into years ago, 15 years ago thereabout, is now you're very clear you're being part of a bigger, much bigger territorial planning group now.
Yes, sir. And we've always planned, the utilities are in the Southeast, the South Carolina utilities have always planned closely with one another outside of even any kind of FERC requirements. And that was the case even with Order 1000. I think what we determined, though, for compliance and just all the heavy lift that is this order, it just didn't make sense to try to continue to do that as a two-utility entity. And right. Just looking at the map, it just, we're encircled by Southeastern RTP. It just made too much sense it made sense previously to stay separate, but with all that's here, we felt like for complying with this order, it just made sense to become a part of that larger region. But it doesn't change any of the day-to-day back and forth the utilities have to plan the systems within that 10-year time frame either. So,
certainly appreciate your answer on that, and thank you for your presentation. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Whitfield. Mr. Cassidy?
If I could follow up on that, what I think I'm hearing, because where I worked, we had a 20-year master plan, but we didn't say we're going to start building that stuff in anticipation that we're going to need that right now. But there were some things like long-term, additional water supply. You don't do that in a week, and such as that. The focus was on the short term. Once you dig a trench, that's most of the work. So what I think I'm hearing is the planning, which would be most likely demand. This is what may occur based on best understanding and guesses of population growth and such as that. And if you need additional rights of ways or things like that, maybe identifying those things. But it doesn't mean you're going to rush out and build it. You're still going to look at, we know we need this, and 5 years from now, you're going to look and see what the projections are. Is that what I'm hearing you kind of say?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it is. I think, at least speaking for Dominion Energy, South Carolina, we, in our comments to this order, I mean, we did, a lot of utilities, I think, felt, and Dominion did, that, 10 years was enough time to plan for things, 10 years out that, when we saw a need, because we're every year, at least every year, we're always updating our, load growth, data centers, generation retirements. And so we see these things coming, and 10 years was ample time to plan for even bigger projects to get them in service. I think FERC felt that if you're talking about regional projects, especially, and that, of course, that's changed as even breakers and things now, what used to take a year, once you decide you want to buy them, now can take 3-4 years. So that 10 years is getting eaten up. But I think FERC felt that, a farther look out to plan these larger projects that might span states and maybe 500 kV and require a lot of right-of-way, those things, that 10 years was not enough. But it does have things in there letting you, if you just determine that you have the time to revisit this, it's a 5-year, every 5-year revisit this. If you can revisit it and see if anything's changed, because, you know, the downside of that is, you know, very few people know what 20 years from now will look like. So if we thought to go back 20 years, data centers and all the, you know, solar batteries. So we argued, you know, how do you, that's very uncertain the further out you go, but there's mechanisms in there to revisit it and not make decisions now for 20 years from now that you won't have a chance to revisit. So it built in some of those things. I don't know, Sammy, did you have any other thoughts?
No, I think you make a very good point in that, yeah, you can identify a transmission facility in the first cycle, and the constraint doesn't really show up until, you know, year 15 to 20, and so you can table it to the next cycle. But there may be a facility that comes up and it shows you need it within 10 years. And then there may be, I think there's a scenario where local projects are shown to be better than a regional project identified. That has to be considered as well.
And I would assume it would be whether your utility is in a high-growth area, which ours was forever, Spartanburg County, and David knows that, or if it's in Montana, where I'm not trying to belittle Montana, mind you, but I suspect there's a difference. Right. You know, looking at a plan every 5 years, you might need to every 3 years. You might do it 10 years and nothing changed. But thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Any further commissioner comments, questions? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. That is an awful lot to absorb, and we do appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break. If we could be back at just a little after 3 and allow, unless there's anything further from Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Chairman, that's it for the 3 utilities.
We'll come back about 5 after 3, and then we'll let ORS make their presentation. Thank you. We're in recess. Good afternoon again from the Public Service Commission. We are back on the record as to allowable ex parte communication briefing. It's my understanding that ORS has brought us a witness that's going to wake us up.
Wow, those are some really big shoes to fill. I hope that maybe I'll bring a little sunshine to this, which is, the act that I follow is very difficult to follow. Mr. Parker and Mr. Roberts are premier in their field. I clearly am not a transmission planning engineer, but I do come to talk to you a little bit about what the ORS is doing as the relevant state entity. Just by way of introduction, my name is Dawn Hipp, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer with the Office of Regulatory Staff. As you've heard this afternoon, we serve as the relevant state entity as designated by this commission for purposes of stakeholder engagement under FERC 1920. In that role, ORS represents South Carolina customers in the ongoing discussions with SERTP and the other RSCs to determine specifically whether agreement can be obtained regarding the cost allocation of new regional transmission facilities developed and built by the transmission providers under the long-term regional transmission plans contemplated under FERC Order 1920. To support that work, ORS staff from our energy operations area and our energy planning area are actively participating in both the stakeholder meetings and the RSC meetings hosted by SERTP. In addition, ORS retained the consulting services of GDS Associates to assist us in the examination of the reasonableness of any proposed cost allocation proposals and to evaluate the cost-benefit methodologies proposed by SERTP, and to make sure that the cost implications to South Carolina customers are known at that time. GDS participates alongside of ORS in all of the stakeholder and RSC meetings. As you heard from Mr. Roberts and Mr. Parker earlier, SERTP has hosted both stakeholder and RSC meetings to develop these processes, and they are processes and methodologies only. There are no hard costs. There is no evaluation of specific transmission planning proposals. It is just simply the methodologies and cost allocation. Based on those discussions, in November 2025, ORS issued written questions to SERTP regarding the ex-ante proposal and benefits measures that were presented to the RSC stakeholders. In December 2025, ORS met with other state RSCs to share preliminary thoughts on SERTP's ex-ante proposal and also to discuss future RSC coordination. In January 2026, the RSCs for North Carolina, Kentucky, and South Carolina provided written feedback to SERTP on the proposals, which were designed to assist us in our RSC capacity in our review of the proposed ex-ante cost methodology and benefits calculation. Also in January 2026, ORS continued our discussion with our South Carolina utilities on the written questions we had issued earlier in November. We anticipate and look forward to additional discussions with the South Carolina utilities, the other RSCs, and SERTP during upcoming meetings regarding the benefits measurement, scenario development, cost allocation, the state agreement process, and other elements required in the compliance filings that will be made at FERC in December of 2026. Once the SC utilities file their compliance filings with FERC, RSCs and other stakeholders will be provided an opportunity to comment at FERC prior to FERC taking action on the compliance filings. We appreciate the transparency of our South Carolina utilities during this unique FERC process, and it is unique. And we look forward to continuing our work on behalf of South Carolina customers. That is an update from the relevant state entity on our activities in participating in stakeholder meetings, and I welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you, Ms. Hipp. If I remember correctly, there were appeals going on about a year ago with all these changes with FERC. is all that settled, all that over? And maybe I should have asked the gentleman earlier, but are there this order was under appeal, or there were reconsiderations, objections? Is all that settled now?
I think it would be best if Mr. Cooper addressed that. I understand there to be one appeal pending, but Mr. Cooper might have a better
And as far as
lens
waking
on
us
that.
up, that yellow does it.
Chairman,
Cooper, you're welcome to answer yourself. You don't need to put somebody back up.
yes, just briefly, there's just one appeal left, and it's for the First Circuit that's being briefed right now.
Any other commissioner questions? Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have a question, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to thank Ms. Hipp for bringing this to us and participating today, because as some of us know, but a lot of times the public or our citizens and ratepayers may not know, and other interested parties may not know, NARUC and FERC have had collaboratives for the last several years in these matters, and many state commissions participate directly in it because of our model of Act 175 and ORS. We're, of course, our South Carolina Commission cannot participate, so we appreciate you informing us on these ongoing meetings that you're going to be having between now and in October, and then again by the end of the year. And we certainly appreciate your updates and obviously the presentation before, and just like to thank you for that, and keep us in the loop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further commissioner questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything further from ORS?
Nothing further, Mr. Chair.
Anything further, Mr. Cooper?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, nothing further.
All right. Well, then I guess that's it. Thank you all very much. Very informative. It's a lot to take in, and we will certainly do that. And hope everyone has a great weekend. We are adjourned.